Welcome to part 2 of Dungeons and Dragons versus Daggerheart. Fight! So what we're going to do today on RPG Boons is we're going to make a quick comparison of Daggerheart and Dungeons and Dragons. If you didn't get a chance, go back and look at part 1 when we looked at the very basic core mechanics of Daggerheart and compared them to D&D. We talked about that 2d12 system favoring the players, how the GM only rolls a d20. We talked about those hope and fear dice, how hope represents hero action points, fear dice represent GM action points. And we talked about how there is no initiative in Daggerheart and how that actually increases the dynamic play within an RPG system. For part 2, we're going to talk a little bit about the armor class system, hit points, stress, whatever that is, and just a few differences between Daggerheart and Dungeons and Dragons. Let's go. Now that we understand the basic mechanics of combat, let's look at the damage system. Since armor is the one thing that's going to protect you from getting damaged, let's take a look at how that works first. In Dungeons and Dragons, you pick an armor such as plate mail, and you get an AC of 18, and if somebody rolls between a 10 and a 17 towards you, it is implied in the roll that that armor deflects the damage. If you haven't watched my video about role-playing armor class correctly, please go look at those videos and you'll find it there. But essentially, rolling from a 10 and a 17 hits the armor, and you don't have to worry about armor after that. In Daggerheart, armor functions as a damage reduction. So you can see here, looking at full plate armor, it has an armor score of 9. That means anytime your hero takes damage, you can reduce it by 9. However, when you think about those hit points, it works a little bit different in Daggerheart compared to Dungeons and Dragons. In Dungeons and Dragons, every hit point and every point of damage matters. You have to calculate it, you have to watch it, you have to keep track of it. But in Daggerheart, there's only 6 to 12 hit points you have to track. You still roll for damage, but you have to get through these thresholds. In this case, I'm showing an example of 5, 10, and 15, which this is numbers that I just made up. But essentially, if you roll between a 5 and a 10, you do 1 hit point damage, 10 to a 15, you do 2 hit points of damage. And if you do a 15 or higher, you take 3 points of damage. And then you can use that armor to reduce the number of damage that you take in, and thereby reducing the number of hit points you're going to take in Daggerheart. In addition, they included this other attribute called stress, which essentially to me sounds like endurance. Stress right here represents the mental and physical strain put on your character during their adventure. To me, that sounds like endurance, and this is just an extra factor that they've included in Daggerheart. I should also mention that when that rolled damage is less than whatever your minimum threshold is, you take a point of stress. And there's an example here. If you lose 5 stress points, you essentially take 1 hit point of damage. And so here what we're looking at is just examples of using those numbers. Remember, we talked about that evasion score, which is essentially a hero's armor class. Only heroes have that. Now, these evasion scores basically work like a dexterity modifier in Dungeons and Dragons. When the DM rolls to hit and he rolls to less than that number, you're essentially able to dodge the attack. We can see a bard and a guardian have 2 different types of evasion scores, the bard being more swifty, the guardian being less swifty. And then you can see these damage thresholds for the bard, it's 3, 8, 13, while it's clearly higher for the guardian at 6, 11, and 16. So what about combat distances? You know, Daggerheart has its own way of measuring distances. They really simplify the combat distances. What you can see here is they're going to give you 5 basic distances: melee, very close, close, far, and very far. So you really don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about those distances. You can just broadly say where you think the enemies are. This will really help you have theater of the mind, so you don't have to worry and exactly track all those numbers. But if you like really crunchiness, they do provide some numbers and feed to associate with those distances so that you can use them if you want to use them. And as you guys know, in Dungeons and Dragons, everything is pre-written down, so you know exactly the range of those weapons. The next thing I want to talk about is downtime, short rest and long rest. Now, I think this is pretty brilliant. Most of the time in Dungeons and Dragons, the only people who can use short rests are people such as the warlock to get their spell slots back, or a fighter who wants to get some of his who wants to get that action surge back. But in Daggerheart, you can use these short rests to actually do something. Every single player has an opportunity to do something. So you feel a little more useful when you're doing those short rests. In addition, there's long rest. Again, it gives every single player something to do. You can fix your armor, you can clear some stress, you can tend to your wounds. This is awesome. Now, Truth be told, in Dungeons and Dragons in Chapter 8, there is a portion about the long rest. There's an entire section about downtime, and it has something similar to this, but clearly Daggerheart has put a much better mechanic together for these short rests and long rests for the players, really making it useful for all of them. Do I need new dice to play Daggerheart? And the answer is no. If you very quickly look at this chart, we can see on the bottom right here, there's a D4, D6, D8, D10. And if you go online and get this free sample packet, you'll see there's also even a weapon that does 1D20. One thing that really stands out, if you look at these damages, let's look at this battle axe. It does 1d10 plus 2, okay? But if you look at a dagger, it does d8. Okay, so right away, we see there is going to be a little bit differences in the way damage is calculated, essentially saying that you can use a dagger just as good as someone can use a battle axe. I don't know. So one thing we're going to do right now is we're going to take a step back and look at character creation. Right here in Daggerheart, they list 14 different steps. Okay, if you look at Dungeons and Dragons, that very first chapter, there's 6 steps. But if you include chapter 4, where there's some backgrounds and you can create some ideals, bonds, and flaws, we're going to looking at closer to maybe 8 to 9 more steps for that Dungeons and Dragons character creation. And if you look at some of these steps for Daggerheart, are actually information you pull directly off of the character sheets. So it's actually not that many steps when you really think about it. And when you think about Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of these steps are actually included in part of the character racial traits, as well as some of the class traits when you actually start building that character as well. So they might be actually comparable to each other. Now in Dungeons and Dragons, we have ability scores, right? We have strength, wisdom, and so forth. In Daggerheart, they have essentially the same 6 different ability scores, but they're calling them character traits. Now, the one thing that really stands out is instead of having just dexterity, they separated it into agility, which is whole body fast movement, and finesse, which is kind of more fine movement with your hands, which is essentially is the true definition of dexterity. And constitution seems to be missing, suggesting it won't play a role like it would in Dungeons and Dragons. When it comes to giving those ability scores or character traits, distributing those points to those character traits, it works very similar to the Dungeons and Dragons standard array. I have that listed on the right: 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, 8. And then character traits, they give you a +2, +1, +1, 0, 0, -1. I still don't understand why we have to have negatives for our heroes, but that is something I'll be discussing in another video. In addition, Dungeons and Dragons has a second way of generating ability scores, and that's the 46 method, minus that one die that you don't like. And essentially, you can distribute those points across the 6 different ability scores. Let's talk about races. Okay. In Daggerheart, they call them ancestries. And then on top of ancestries, you can add a community. Now, this is very interesting. In Dungeons and Dragons, when you're a dwarf, if you went and saw that Tasha's video, when you're a dwarf, you come from certain types of backgrounds. If you're a mountain dwarf, you get certain kinds of traits. If you're a hill dwarf, you get certain kinds of traits. And then some things are just inherent about dwarves. If you read the descriptions in the beginning of the dwarves, it tells you a lot about where do dwarves come from. Now, I think this is kind of brilliant when it comes to Daggerheart. A lot of times, especially in that Tasha video, I had a few people tell me, what if I want to be a dwarf that grew up in the city? In Daggerheart, they essentially allow you to do this. They created ancestry, which is essentially something that's inherent about those races, maybe genetics involved or something. And then they created community. So now you can be a dwarf that either lived in the mountains with all the other dwarves, or you can be a dwarf that was a pirate, was highborn in a high society, or you were actually from the mountains or the hills. So it really gives a lot more flexibility for those races, which I think is something that Tasha was trying to do. But now they give it to you here. So in Daggerheart, at least, that standard way of life, the standard dwarves that we think about when we think about Lord of the Rings, do not really exist in Daggerheart, or at least you don't have to play them that way. And in Daggerheart, there's 18 different races that you can play. There's 9 ways of life, aka community. Now let's compare that with Dungeons and Dragons. So here, I mentioned earlier, you have races, they have inherent racial traits, but in addition, every single one of those races has some type of background. So essentially, instead of having options in community and being able to choose different backgrounds, Dungeons and Dragons gives you the background associated with every single race. But also, let's just keep in mind Dungeons and Dragons has expanded the races tremendously. But that is something we're not going to worry about now because I think once Daggerheart gets its third party content creators and becomes very successful, we'll start seeing more races potentially in Daggerheart as well. The next thing I wanted to talk about were classes. You can see here on the left, Daggerheart has 9 classes and 2 domains with every single one of those classes, essentially subclasses. In Dungeons and Dragons, the very basics are 12 classes, each of those with having around 2 to 3 different subclasses that you can play. In addition, both have multi-classing. So at least at the moment, Dungeons and Dragons seems to have a little bit more versatility or a little bit more classes that you can play compared to Daggerheart. However, I think simplifying it is a much better way to go when it comes to Daggerheart. And when you think about it, Dungeons and Dragons might have gone overboard on those subclasses. When you think about the fighter Eldritch Knight and compare that to the War Mage, there's subtle differences. I mean, there's differences, but basically it's the same class. So with Daggerheart, simplifying the system makes a lot more sense. Another thing we can look at are character sheets. Maybe just by looking at a character sheet, we can try to determine the complexity of the game in itself. So here on the left, we're looking at a sorcerer at level 1. And then if we look on the right, we're looking at a wizard at level 1. By looking at both of these, I think we're looking about the same level of complexity, even though that the Dungeons and Dragons sheet gives you a lot more lines to work with. The Daggerheart purposely gives you a lot less lines to try to make it more concise and to have the appearance of being a lot more simplified and a lot more streamlined. Now, it's really up to you which system you want to play. Clearly, Daggerheart has made a huge effort to make things a little more dynamic. And as I mentioned, I really like that short rest and long rest, giving your players something to do. I also like those hero points and DM points that you can roll based on that hope and fear dice. And I think the bottom line is these core game mechanics are for conflict resolution, and you got to make a decision which one do you want to buy into. D&D has so much material you can work with, and Daggerheart, it's in its beta test, and we're just going to have to wait to see what's going to happen in the future with that product. And I think that's going to be it for part 2 of Daggerheart versus Dungeons and Dragons. Fight! Well, I hope that was useful. I really wanted to take an unbiased approach and really just show the differences between Daggerheart and Dungeons and Dragons. My name is Don Franco 3. This is RPG Boons, where we talk about everything RPG and how everything is RP. Hit the subscribe button. Please leave some comments. Love talking with you guys. I'll catch you next time.